The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame. Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games that respect your time. I'm Raygan Kelly, and I am joined by my cool co-host,
Nate Heininger.
How are you doing, Nate?
I'm doing well. Thumb's a little sore.
Oh, yeah.
You know, almost threw my Switch a few times, but to me that's the hallmark of a good platformer. So I'm excited to talk about this game. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing as well as can be expected under the circumstances, which is all anyone can say right now. But yeah, I had a lot of fun this week playing The Messenger on the Nintendo Switch. The Messenger isn't exactly a new game. It came out in the summer of 2018, and it's sort of been on my list to cover for the show for a while. But it, for one reason or another, kept not filtering onto our list. One aspect of that is that it is on the long side for us. And actually, I need to probably preface this whole conversation by saying that when I started playing The Messenger, I thought it was a great deal shorter than it actually was. Even looking at how long to beat, it is listed as about an 11 to 11 and a half hour game, unless you're being a completionist, which I'm usually not. So I thought, well, that's just a little bit of a stretch, but hey, I've got some time. We're all quarantined. This is I thought this would still fit pretty well into our short game zone. And looking at the in-game clock, I am actually at about 14 and a half hours, which is, long on the long side for the short game.
It is, and I think we're actually going to talk a little bit about that later on, about how maybe this game actually would have been better if it fits within our expectations or what we look for in shorter games. That said, when we talk about games that respect your time, it's constantly throwing new things. It has easy save points, constant save points. So while it is longer, you can definitely tackle it at your own pace and really have no downsides. Yeah, this is the type of game that you could probably play for 3 or 4 hours, put it down for a month, and outside of some of the muscle memory of a more challenging platformer, you can pick it right back up and spend another hour, and you will have left nothing behind.
Well, let's set up the game. So The Messenger is a action platformer. It's by a developer called Sabotage Studios and published by Devolver Digital, and it came out on the Nintendo Switch and PC, and since that time it's also come out on all of the other things. So it's on Xbox and PlayStation, if you have a device that you can play action platformers on, it's probably going to be available on that. It's very 8-bit styled on the face of it, and we're going to be having a early spoiler break to talk about some of the surprises and twists that it throws at you. One of the things that this game is sort of famous for is an important mid-game twist that was still surprising to me, even though I kind of knew it was coming, sort of. So we're going to try to reserve some of that later game post-twist stuff for after a light spoiler break, but it's going to be really hard to talk about this game as a whole without spoiling some of that stuff. So we're going to have a fairly early spoiler break in the show, and mostly what we're talking about are mechanics spoilers, not story spoilers. So if that's the sort of thing that you care about, you can stop at the spoiler break, but otherwise continue listening. We're going to talk about the many ways that this game kind of expresses its action platformer heritage in different ways.
It's really, really an interesting take. I would say if this game is interesting to you, even from this early description, I would just pause now and go and play it and then come back to listen, because it's hard to, this is going to be a hard line to walk, because it really is a mechanic thing. And that's unlike most of our spoiler breaks, where it's like really easy to just, hey, don't say the narrative twist, and that's not really the case here. It's all about just what you're doing in the game.
The big thing that I could say that isn't a spoiler is that if you enjoy the action platforming mechanics of this game, the very Ninja Gaiden 8-bit style run and jump and sword swipe basics of this game, those persist throughout. So this game has some different ways of letting you kind of play with those controls, basically different ways of structuring things, which we'll talk about a little later. If you enjoy the physical action of this game, then that continues to be good and fun and challenging from beginning to end. And the things that suddenly shift beneath your feet in the middle of this game are not things that are going to affect your enjoyment if you're still enjoying that action platforming.
Yeah. So let's set up the story just a little bit. And then we'll jump into the core mechanics of the game. So in the game starts with a really epic opening, classic old video game opening. Definitely going to be paraphrasing here, but essentially there's some sort of demon king that is going to come back at some point and destroy the world, but there's a prophecy that at the same time the hero of the West is going to come back and deliver a scroll to a top of a mountain, and that will defeat the demon king or something like that. And you play as the messenger, the person who's going to be delivering that scroll. It's really just a setup for your character to have to move across a world from zone to zone to zone, from like a marsh to an underground catacombs to an icy mountain peak and things like that, to deliver the scroll and fight the various demons and creatures that just exist in these types of environments.
Right, and it's very much pulling its structure from that 8-bit NES era of action platformers. So you're moving left to right across, it gives you a map that's very reminiscent of the old Castlevania, or lots of other 8-bit games did the same sort of vibe, but like if you remember back in the Castlevania games, especially Castlevania 3, you had these stages, but occasionally you'd see this sort of world map that kind of tied those stages together. I'm also thinking of things like Ghosts and Goblins, and this sort of world map that gives you a sense of place. And so in the Messenger, what that is this massive island that has different zones within it, culminating in a mountain peak, like Nate said, where we're moving left to right, trying to fight demons and other monsters along the way, and trying to deliver that scroll. Very NES style structure, and even kind of NES style in the way that it sets things up. So it's got the very sort of NES style cutscenes where it's just text and some maybe scrolling 8-bit looking images to kind of set up the world.
It's very epic. Yeah, it's epic for its time, right?
Yeah.
It's very simple, but the story is presented in this really epic, prophecies and demon lords and all of that.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, the setup is very, very NES, but the things that feel feel more advanced than that. First of all, the gameplay style is really, really, really polished, and feels like a modern take on the hardcore NES action platformers, aka the Ninja Gaiden type things. The big things that I think are really important to the way this game plays. One is that you have your sword swipe. Most of your combat is done via a very short range sword swipe kind of action, where you slash out with your ninja sword, and it's got a pretty short reach. You don't slow down at all when slashing. So almost every enemy in the game takes only one hit to kill. But also almost every enemy in the game does pretty significant damage to you. So it's about being careful about, positioning and everything. And you can generally, you can run full speed at an enemy and slash them and run right through without letting up the forward button most of the time, which gives it a really fast pace and a lot of momentum when you're kind of moving through levels. You're doing a lot of jump and slash and jump and slash and jump and slash without needing to slow down, which feels great when you make it work. And a few other things about it. The jumping is, so it's got a pretty traditional basic, jump arc, but then in addition to that, it has a really, from the very beginning, you have a mechanic called cloud stepping. The cloud step mechanic is basically that if you jump and then midair you hit something with your sword, then you can jump again. And there's no limit on that. So if you can continue to attack mid-air, then you can continue to jump mid-air, but you only get one jump for every slash. So basically, if you can chain together killing a bunch of enemies before you hit the ground, you can continue in these massive jump chains. But that's very, very hard to do because, of course, if you miss one of those slashes, you're going to take damage and it has knockback and you'll fall down probably into a pit or something. So it's high risk, high reward, challenging action platformer mechanics that really just make it feel like you have a lot of forward momentum, constantly moving. And I don't know, for me, I thought it felt really, really good while also being really hard.
Yeah. It's a couple other points I think that stood out to me. So I did not play a lot of those games, Ninja Gaiden and whatnot.
Me neither, actually. I didn't really discover Ninja Gaiden games until emulation, like pretty late. I didn't have an NES, but they felt for me a lot like some of the games inspired by those games from the Genesis, which is sort of where I hopped on that kind of gameplay.
It's funny, the thing that I kept thinking about is my cousin had a Nintendo, and he had the Karate Kid game. And it really, I kept having like flashbacks of playing that game for this. So if there's anyone out there that has played that game, I don't really know if it's anything actually like this, but that was like something that kept coming to mind for me during this game.
This game does a great job of playing like you remember NES games feeling, sort of, if that makes sense. It's like more advanced and more modern in a lot of ways, but those ways are subtle. It feels like you remember those games being.
Yeah. Another, a couple thoughts about the mechanics too is that the jump always felt heavy, if that makes sense. I think with a lot of platformers, we're used to kind of a floaty element of it, and not in this game. You fall, pretty quickly, I think, compared to a lot of platformers, and so that makes those combos that you're talking about, the slash jump, a little more tricky than I think it would be if it was with a Celeste or like a Mario weight. So to your point, that whole thing adds this feeling of like speed and like density. You fall fast, you swipe fast. There's a lot of things that are happening on the screen that are fast. That said, one thing that is not really actually ever that fast, except for maybe a boss or two, are the enemies. Mm-hmm. The enemy placement in this game is interesting. They're more there to like impede your forward progress than to necessarily cause any individual challenge. They're placed in a way that's going to make a jump difficult. They're shooting fireballs. A thing that like for this entire game was constantly catching me off guard is that projectiles pass like in front of the terrain and pass through everything. So you might have a guy who shoots fireballs entirely on the right side of the screen, and for you have to go through a whole series of like jumps and ladders and ups and downs, but the fireball he shoots is just going to go right across everything, and it can hit you. Or there are parts with classic sort of cave thing where like a stalactite, the one on the ceiling, falls, and you might think you're safe because you're under something, but you're not. It just passes right through it, and the only thing it can hit is you. So there's a lot of things that come to you in that way, but really, I think the way that I died, like 95% of the time, was falling in a freaking pit. There are so many open pits in this game that it's like that was almost always how I died. The enemies are never that challenging. Like, they do a lot of damage, but you've got 6 health points, and there's frequent places where you can get health. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I would die from those from time to time, don't get me wrong, usually trying to go too fast and like not swiping at exactly the right time and running directly into the enemy instead of what I was planning on doing, which was swiping and moving through it. But most of the time it's like I'm trying to make a jump, there's a guy on the platform on the other side, I mess up the jump, he hits you and you fall back down into the pit or something like that. There's just constantly little things slowing you down and impeding you, but not any individual challenge. But they all add up slowly but surely to drain you, and you die that way instead of like, I don't know, like a really difficult enemy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It is a lot of things like, the enemies being placed in just a spot where you have to be very precise about timing in order to get in and kill them without falling in a pit, that sort of thing. Lots of that kind of thing.
It's a slashing game, but it's not like a hack and slash, like you're almost never just like mowing through enemies.
Right. You always feel threatened or challenged. Like it's very, like even in the very last stages, just moving around through spaces, sometimes even spaces I'd been through before, was always difficult and challenging. Like there's never a feel of like, I've fully mastered this space and can move through it at will, like you can sometimes get in like, other types of platformers where, eventually maybe in a zone that was difficult for you, either because of mastery or upgrades, is suddenly trivial and just a place to pass on through. Even going back to early stages, it was always challenging.
Yeah, you really have to focus. There's enough there, and there's enough instant kill stuff. If you're not falling in a pit, you're getting crushed by something.
Yeah.
There's enough that like you're not paying attention. You're trying to just move fast. You've been in this area. Maybe you die right near the end of a checkpoint, so you have to do a whole area again. And you can't just breeze through it because you got good. Like you really have to focus. It is kind of a game that you want to play fast, but really you're going to be most successful if you are methodical.
Also, well, speaking about the dying, another place that this game tried to be innovative, and I think succeeded somewhat. It's maybe not quite as innovative as some other similar games, like I thought often of Shovel Knight, but they were trying to be creative with the way they handled lives and continues. So rather than when you die, you have a certain number of lives or anything like that. They obviously that feels pretty antique today, but just having truly unlimited lives and checkpoints sometimes feels a little bit like, particularly if you're applying that to a game that is so heavily inspired by retro games, it can feel a little bit like not challenging enough or like consequence free. So the way that this game sort of punishes you for death is with a so first of all, there's frequent checkpoints, really frequent, not necessarily every screen. Every screen has some sort of challenge on it, and there are definitely times in this game where I was like, man, I wish there was a checkpoint a little closer to this place where I keep dying. But for the most part, if you're playing through at a typical speed, you're probably going to be encountering a checkpoint every 3 to 5 screens. When you die, there is this little demon named Quarble, and Quarble will resurrect you at the last checkpoint. But he doesn't do it entirely for free. He then follows you around, and as you collect, there's a sort of currency in this game, and I'm not actually sure what they are. They're little like flame...
I think they're called
shards.
Time shards.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, little crystals. And if you have died recently, then Quarble will hang out near you, float around you for a certain amount of time. I'm not actually sure how long. I think it's maybe a couple of minutes or something. And any time shards that you collect during that time go to Quarble, not to your stash. And those time shards are important because those are how you upgrade. So if you are dying constantly, just throwing yourself into pits again and again and again, you're not accumulating any time shards. Quarble doesn't take time shards from your stash. So if you have saved up, say, 600 time shards, and then you get to a point where you're dying a lot, it's not going to take your existing time shards away. It's just going to really stop you from accumulating new time shards until you've stayed alive for a while. Which I thought was a really interesting, fair way to do it. And something I saw the developers mention about this mechanic that I thought was clever was that they wanted a mechanic that would, be really simple for people who just want to, be able to die a bunch without feeling like a lot of pressure. And they also wanted something that would be a kind of, they described it as a dunce cap mechanic for people like streamers or speedrunners, because they wanted, if you're playing this game on a stream and you've got Quarble hanging around, floating around you, then that means you've been screwing up. Whereas if Quarble's nowhere to be seen, then you have been staying alive. And I think that's a really, really smart solution. And also, like, Quarble is he's a character. Every time you die, you get a little quote from Quarble. And I think I've seen every single damn one of those.
Oh my god, yeah. It gets to the point where you're not even looking at him anymore, because you die a lot in this game.
My final total was more than 550 deaths.
Nice. I don't know what my total is right now, but Quarble will tell you every once in a while, and the last one I saw was somewhere in the 300s, and I think you are several hours ahead of me. I have died a lot in this game. I will, I've got to eat my hat a little bit on this one. You've definitely heard me talk on this podcast about platformers being like my thing. I'm really bad at a lot of types of video games, but there's a couple genres that I consider myself really good at. I never felt good at this game. I felt like
it's not designed to make you feel good at it.
I know, but I feel like I just died my way through this game. And so you get to the point where you're not even reading the Quarble thing, because you've seen it you've seen all of them. Every once in a while it's his brother Quibble. There was one really, they're kind of funny though, so I definitely recommend reading them. One of the ones that really made me laugh is I fell in a pit in a really dumb way, and it was the first time I'd seen this, where Quarble says something to the effect of like, "Oh great, now I get to see what your face looks like when you fall in a pit." And I know for a fact that I had like gone like, "Ugh," and made like a stupid face because I fell in a pit in a stupid way. And then it says that. It was very funny. I also think that the Quarble mechanic, it was a problem solver in a different way. And I think it's pretty clever, because I do think it's an amount of time shards that you collect before it goes away, because there's a power up that reduces the amount that he needs to collect before he goes away.
Yeah, that makes
sense. So I don't think it's time. I think it's a number. But so the problem that I think it solves though is that because everything resets every time you die, all the enemies, and there are little like lanterns everywhere that are attackable, and they give you time shards, they give you health, they give you the shurikens that you can throw. Those respawn, and so theoretically you could farm in this game if you wanted to, right? If you die, if a checkpoint had a bunch of those respawnable things that give you money, you could die, hit those, collect like the 10 or 15 time shards, jump in a pit, die, collect the 10 or 15 time shards, and you could rinse and repeat really, really quickly if you wanted to. And there are definitely players who would do that, right? You would be able to get all the upgrades in a really quick way. And you still could technically do that, but I think Quarble slows that down enough where it would be excruciating to do it. So I do think it solves that problem, which is it kind of mitigates the amount of time shards you earn by dying. You get no reward from your death, because otherwise, if you got all of those time shards for the first like 2 or 3 screens that you have to do over and over and over to get to the more difficult part, there would never be any currency problem in this game. But I found that the currency actually scaled really, really well.
Yeah.
I assume that they actually scale. I could be wrong, but it felt like they're actually modifying like the amount of money Quarble takes to keep your currency at like the appropriate level.
They
like
might have been, yeah. I'm not sure, but I can definitely say that like I bought the final upgrade before the final level, and that's like that means that the economy of the game was like lining up with its length and design.
Yeah, and I think it's because of Quarble. I mean, because if not, like, you die hundreds of times and you're replaying the same screens hundreds of times, each of which would be giving you time shards. But because of Quarble, you're not getting them, until generally you kind of get back to where you were, right?
Yeah.
So I thought it was, when I was playing, to me, that's what I expected. To me, like, that's what I assumed the creation of Portable was. You know, it's like the points that you gave that the developers actually said are awesome. I mean, the dunce cap thing is
a
hilarious.
good solution that solves multiple problems. So I will say, like, I didn't think it was as interesting and innovative as something like the Dark Souls inspired death mechanics in something like Shovel Knight. But at least they were trying something that I don't think I've seen in exactly this way before. This sort of like, it's not exactly like a tax to respawn. If it had been just a straight, like, here you have to pay 100 shards every time you respawn, I would have been out of shards very quickly in some areas. But because it's more sort of like a tax, it's like an income tax basically. It's like, well,
yeah, it's the same way. It's taking it from what you're about to earn instead of what you already earned,
right?
Which in a way kind of feels better because you never see that number go down.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Shovel Knight would kind of drive me crazy sometimes when or like Sonic, right? You get hit and you're like, my riches! It just goes.
They go flying, yes. Oh god, that's depressing in Sonic the Hedgehog. But at least in Sonic the Hedgehog, there's nothing you're saving up for.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So yeah, we've talked through, I think, most of the important mechanics stuff. The last thing I'll say before we start to talk about something that is definitely a mechanics spoiler for the sort of second half-ish of the game is that the game initially feels like this, say, I think it's like 8-stage, I might be getting that number wrong, NES platformer. It has bosses and mini-bosses and a structure that feels just like that. But towards the end of the game, you get to basically what would be the final boss of the, let's say, the original NES game here. And then there is a mechanical or structural twist that changes the structure of the game. And this is where we get into spoiler territory. So again, I don't know if we need like a full-on spoiler break. I'm not going to edit the sound effect in here. The game came out in 2018, and this is stuff that has been, at the very least, strongly alluded to in marketing for the game and also in reviews for the game. You can't really look up a review for this game that doesn't address what we're about to be talking about by at least the 4th or 5th paragraph. So all that said, we're about to start talking about the second quote-unquote half of the game, which for me, at least in my playthrough, is more like the last 2/3 of the game, wherein things change up a little bit. So if you were wanting to surprise yourself with that stuff, now's the time for maybe pausing the show. But Nate, let's talk about that the big twist.
Yeah, so like you said, the game is incredibly linear. You have an idea of what's coming. The boss structure is the same every single time. You know when you're about to have a boss, you know what's coming up. Well, you finally beat the last boss, and you go through a wacky series of cutscenes again, and suddenly, dun dun dun, this game becomes a Metroidvania.
Does it though? Because here's the thing. Like, I know this is because I know this is going to be pedantic, and I apologize in advance for being pedantic. But I think a lot of people have said this game becomes a Metroidvania, and I had heard that before. And then when I actually got into it, it's not exactly what I think of when I think of a Metroidvania. It shifts from being very linear to being very exploration focused, but it's not so much focused on the Metroidvania style design map of finding new upgrades that unlock new areas. That for me, I think like the key to a Metroidvania is that your upgrades, you're not just finding keys. Your upgrades are both useful in-game items or actions or weapons, and also unlock new parts of the exploration for you. And for me, I don't really think this will like fit that structure, but it did definitely feel like a big shift from like linear 8-bit style game to 16-bit style exploration-oriented platformer with a world map that you can jump around with some fast travel and explore and find secrets.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely probably pretty pedantic, but I mean, you could also argue that the first half of the game, you are unlocking the power to travel through time. And then the second half of the game, you're using that power to travel through time and some of the upgrades that you've gotten, earlier on to go and access areas that you were unable to access before. So if you look at like the whole game as a Metroidvania, you just can't access those points until you unlock the skills.
Yeah, I don't think it's crazy to call it a Metroidvania. I just think for what I think was very interesting about it is that like it takes this shift in structure, but it keeps its levels more or less the same. It just gives you Nate mentioned that you get the ability to travel through time. Well, aesthetically, what it does with that is very cool. Basically, there are points in this game where you can switch from the 8-bit style to a more advanced 16-bit style. So the music shifts from NES style 8-bit chiptune music to more like Genesis style 16-bit, FM synthesis type of music, which is very cool. Then you also get a different graphical style, shifts from an 8-bit graphical style to something that looks a little more, to me, like SNES style, 16-bit style. But in that shift, mostly the levels look the same in their 8 and 16-bit versions, but there will be sometimes subtle differences, sometimes very big differences. And that allows you to go places that you wouldn't have been able to go. So maybe if you have a level where there's like a dead end, and then you travel through time, maybe in the future, that dead end has been, I guess, carved out, and now you can pass through that spot. Lots of things like that, and it plays with that sort of like multiple versions of the same space thing throughout the whole rest of the game, and it does it really well and interestingly.
Yeah, it really opens the game up. It was a pretty big surprise that the game was not done when it really feels like the game is going to be done. That being said, there were several things to me early on that indicated that there was probably more coming because one, there's the power seals that you collect throughout the game. It's very much like the Celeste strawberries. They are hidden, but to varying degrees. Sometimes hidden in like an incredibly obvious way. Sometimes it's actually a pretty challenging jump or a really well hidden entrance to these things, and you enter into them. They're often one screen challenges that are generally more challenging platformer challenges, and at the end you receive a power seal, and there's a counter in this shop that is telling you once you collect a certain amount of power seals, you'll get a new ability, and that counter is really, really high.
Yeah, it's 45.
And the whole
45.
Yeah, and I was really trying to find them and get them in this game, and just like doing the math and looking at how many like zones there still were, I was like, unless there's like a power seal run coming up, I don't think I've had the opportunity to earn the full amount of power seals that there actually are. So kind of thought there must be something after these bosses that's going to give me a chance to earn more power seals. And then there are some just visual cues that there are areas that you can't get to. There's what looks like platforms or things that you can jump up to, and there's like columns in the way. And what I kept expecting was that I was going to get a power to like punch stuff really, really hard and break down walls. Because I kept seeing things where I was like, I want to go there. I think I should be able to go there, but I can't go there yet. So I was expecting some sort of Metroidvania thing where I was going to go back and like punch through these columns or punch through these walls. And instead it ended up being this wacky time warp thing that was actually more interesting to me than just another, punch that would break things like what I thought would happen. And really the time warp, though, where you're getting the graphics change and the sound change, to me is ultimately like the most interesting thing about this game. I think it's handled really well. It's cool. I've not really seen something like that, and it changes in a flash. Sometimes you are jumping through these. There's a lot of different things that'll make you switch times, but a lot of times it's just like a rift, like a single line. and you are flashing between these things within a moment of each other, and the whole world, the music, everything changes within a flash, and it's really well executed.
Yeah. It's the time skip or time travel mechanic also let them repurpose all of the levels that they had already built as part of this larger world that was more interconnected. So what I was expecting, having heard a little bit of the fact that, okay, this becomes a bit more of a Metroidvania, I was expecting a whole new world map, a whole new set of levels, because the game felt like this very clear linear A to B path through the various stages from the beginning to end. But what was very cool about this was that it kept all of that stuff and just expanded on it with additional routes, additional pathways, and everything. A lot of the levels still kind of maintained their mostly linear nature. But it added, for example, the fact that you can, from any of the save spots, or almost any, you can jump back to a sort of a home base at the Tower of Time, and then use portals from there to various spots within the world. It's not the most convenient, because you can't literally just warp from any save point to any other save point, but you can warp, for example, if you get to a point in a one of these long linear levels where you're like, okay, I've done what I need to do here, you can go to any save point and get out. And then from there, you can jump back in at one of about 6 or 8 different points around the map. And it felt like a really smart and good fast travel system that let you expand this world by giving you these extra routes and extra different ways through these levels, while still leaving those linear levels intact, which was, I thought, really interesting.
You have to do just some of these little challenging areas over and over and over. There's no getting around it. There was this one. It expands the map system in a very funny way.
That was very funny. Like you're carrying the scroll, and then you get through the entire quote unquote NES game, and at some point it's like check your map, and then the character's like, what map? It's like, you've been carrying this scroll the entire time and you haven't even read it. Open it up. Yeah. And it's like, oh, it's a world map.
Yeah, it's very funny. And it gives you the really, really helpful for these types of games, grid-based map where you can see every screen and the entrances and exits to those screens. Mm-hmm. And which I think was necessary and good for this game. Sometimes that it kind of kills exploration a little bit, but also this game is challenging enough that if you had to truly go around and touch every single square and look for every single entrance and exit over and over and over, I think it would be considerably less fun. So what this allows you to do is enter in from one of these warp gates, look at the map, see some of these areas that you haven't explored yet, and then you still have to get there, which can be challenging, but you at least have sort of a destination in mind, and that's why I think it still feels linear. Yeah. You enter in over here, you're trying to get to the screen that's 6 to the right and 3 up or something like that, but you're gonna have to get there and beat everything that's in between there, and it might be different now because of these warp zones. And there was one that I just kept dying over and over and over, and it was something that I had done before already. It was all in the old time, but it was just challenging. So it's really successful. This game definitely does a lot of that stuff to make it just a little bit more manageable, very modern. We've talked about the save points already, but really obvious stuff like right before every boss, there's a save point, and while that boss may have an opening cinematic when you see him the first time, every time after that, you enter the room, game on, fights on. You don't have to see the cinematic ever again, right? Yeah. A lot of nice things like that.
So you mentioned about how this game still kind of feels linear during those parts where you're traversing the map, because you do still sort of come in at a point and know where you're going. Something sort of interesting about that, this game does support the gameplay style of just sort of looking at the map, trying to figure out, there's probably some stuff over there that I haven't checked out, and going and doing a sort of an organic exploration. But given that the game starts very linear and has this high pace, I kind of, once I hit that sort of more Metroidvania-y portion of the game, I sort of felt like what do you mean now I have to start going and exploring and just like poking at every wall or anything? That would have been a nightmare, but the game does do something that I think is smart, but also in a way kind of feels a little bit like they're kind of pulling back a little bit on the Metroidvania-iness of it, which is that you do have first of all, there's a sort of a quest giver character back at the headquarters who will tell you what it is that you need to be doing next. But he tells you he's called the Prophet, and he tells you in a very like obscure kind of way. And so if you want, you can then, first of all, if you want, you don't have to go and talk to him at all. You can just wander the map if you want. But if you do talk to him, you can try to interpret his instructions and go and explore the map and try to find what he's referring to. Or you can go talk to the shopkeeper, who is very plain-spoken, and will charge you 300 time shards to translate the prophecy into a literal dot on your map, and just tell you, okay, here's where you need to go next. So for me, given the way that I had been playing this game, I didn't really feel like I'm like spending a bunch of time just sort of like wandering the map trying to figure out what the prophet meant. I wanted to know where I was supposed to go next, and so I always spent those 300 time shards in order to do that. But you don't have to. So if you, I think it's nice that they kind of support both approaches. That said, like having basically a literal dot on the map for here's your next objective is a very not Metroidvania thing. So
right.
You're kind of, if you do that, which I did, you're kind of opting out of some of the more Metroidvania-ness of it and opting back into the more linear nature that the earlier game kind of trained you to do.
Yeah, there's other ways in which they do that as well. There's an entirely new tree in the upgrade path that slowly but surely makes the map more descriptive, and the final upgrade just straight up tells you where all of the power seals are.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. I think it lets you play this game how you want, because even though I love a good Metroidvania, like I kind of found this game too challenging and at times kind of like too annoying to because of how much I would die and how I never truly felt good or comfortable. I wanted those markers. I wonder how many people who play this game don't. It is a little different for us where we're trying to play like a game every week, and I will often take these things that make it a shorter game for me, because that's what we do here. But
opting into options like map markups and opting out of like extra optional or skippable content is kind of like how we play games for this show. So
yeah, but I do wonder, just like out of percent of like organic players out there, who really was getting to this part of the game and being like, oh, perfect, now I get to like go and do all of that hard stuff again without knowing where I'm supposed to be going. I have to imagine that most people are doing those things. Maybe probably not the prophet, maybe not the guy telling you the mark on the dot, like, or the interpreting the prophecy for you. But I bet most people will do that upgrade tree.
And honestly, I think that's probably the right way to go. I don't think the developers are really intending for you to go through this game blind in that way. There are elements of the Metroidvania structure here that I don't think are particularly well executed and really kind of call for knowing where the next dot on the map is. So an example would be that at some point in the middle of the game, I stumbled across a kind of a Lost Woods style mystery maze. So like if you remember from like a lot of the Legend of Zelda games, you often get this thing where you wander into an area and there's like 5 exits, and you go through an exit and go through another exit and another exit and another exit, and eventually you're back where you started, or you've even left the map or something. Like these map areas where the navigation is wrong and doesn't make sense, and usually there's some trick to that, like, okay, go through the bottom left, bottom right, upper right, down, that sort of thing.
Sure.
So I spent a good while trying to figure that out, and eventually looked it up because I was like getting frustrated. How do I get through this freaking maze? And turned out the answer was, first of all, I didn't have an item that I needed to get through it yet, and there was no real indication that I needed an item there. It was like, but even more confusing than that, a lot of the descriptions that I read about. So I looked this up, and they were like, just go towards the place. So I'm going to spoil this puzzle. Hopefully that's okay. And skip forward 1 or 2 minutes if you don't want to hear this. The answer was you are supposed to hear an audio cue when you're near the correct exit to that zone, or but I wasn't. I was not hearing any audio cues. Well, okay, actually turns out you are supposed to get this item first, and then that item makes it do the audio cues. The audio cue, though, is the music. It's like there will be music if you are near the right exit and no music if you're not. But if you go in there before you get that item, there's always music near all of them. It's the weirdest thing.
That's confusing.
It's very confusing, and it's not a particularly well-designed Metroidvania thing in that there's nothing about it sort of telling you, okay, you need to go to this other place across the map in order to get an item, in this case like a seashell, and then come back here. I think good Metroidvania design is sort of about like, oh, I wish I could reach that higher spot, and I need to be able to climb walls for that. I'm gonna be on the lookout for a wall climbing thing, and then I'll come back here when I know how to wall climb. Like, that kind of stuff is not really present in this game. It's much more sort of like lock and key.
It's also funny because I got that seashell during the beginning of the game, the linear part of it.
Oh, interesting.
I found it, but I had no idea what it would do, and it never told me what it was and what it would do for me. It was one of the clues to me that like this game's gonna open up at some point, because I got this item that literally it won't tell me what it is and won't tell me what it's for, but like it was very confusing when I found that, because it was at the end of a challenging set of things, and I was like, oh nice, I got this new thing, and then I was expecting like the shopkeeper to tell me what it was about, or like some sort of thing to tell me somewhere what this cool thing that I like really fought for, but no, just nothing.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that, like, while we're at it about things that this game does that maybe aren't the best, maybe this is just me, but I think, Nate, sounds like you had a similar experience. There are certain spots in this game that are just too damn hard. I feel like it's hard for me to really like point out exactly like what the like solution to this problem is, because different people play these games at at different skill levels, and the places where I get stuck might be different from the places where you get stuck. But there's really nothing there. It's definitely possible to reach points in this game where like you just can't progress unless you complete a very specific, very difficult manual thing. So for me, for example, there is a chase scene near the end of the game. This is just one example of this, where like you've navigated your way into this very cave-like place, and then there is a large enemy that chases you back out, and you have to kind of reverse and get out very, very quickly. And I had a real hard time doing that. And it was very demoralizing, because every time I died, which happened many, many times in this area, I was respawning at the spot at the start of this chase, literally like the beginning of the chase sequence. And it's definitely possible to get into situations like that in this game. Most of the places where you might die, might have this sort of like serious problems, things like bosses. Yeah, there's the possibility like, okay, I'm gonna maybe back off of this boss for a little while, collect some time shards, maybe get an upgrade or two, or maybe just come back later or something like that. But there's definitely gonna be parts in this game where like there are these difficulty spikes that are just gonna be there until you figure out how to get past them. And it's not really a mental thing, at least for me it wasn't. It was like, I know what I need to do, it's just an execution problem, and I'm old and my hands don't work. I'm super happy to have played this game, and I enjoyed the challenge very much, but I think for me at least, I think they could have tuned it downward by about 10%, and I think I still would have enjoyed the challenge and maybe been a happier overall player, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do agree. For me, it was the bosses. And really only the last few, and they just felt like they went too long.
I've got a little bit too much HP, a few of them.
Yeah, like for a game that really everything you were like moving through and moving fast, the bosses, they're all about pattern, repetition, and execution. So the boss is really going to behave the same way every single time you fight them. You just have to get really, really good at managing that and knowing what each sort of tell is, what it's going to do, and how you avoid damage. It's a lot of just of damage avoidance, and then go really, really hard at the boss in the moments that you have, and then damage avoidance. And almost all the bosses have the same sort of thing. Once you deal a certain amount of damage, they switch into a new phase, and then you have to kind of get good at learning what that new phase is and avoiding it, dealing as much damage. And then there's like a final phase, and so you kind of have to learn each phase and exactly what's going to happen and master avoiding the damage. And I like that thing. I like that approach. That's a fun style. I just felt like they all went just a little too far, where it required too much perfect execution, that it stopped being fun and started becoming tedious. And that's how I felt about a fair amount of this game. I said that at the beginning, that I think this game would have benefited by it being shorter, that, we're both going over 10 hours on this game, and I think it really would have been like perfect if it was like 6 or 7. Maybe cut the amount of zones before the opening up of the game to a shorter amount.
I have a bit of a different take there. Like, I agree with you in principle, but I think that the part of this game that I wouldn't cut a minute of is before the shift. Like, I loved the structure of the like left to right NES style portion of the game, and it felt about the length of an NES game. Like, it really felt true to that structure. It was like they built an entire incredibly good NES game and then tacked a second game onto the end. And I felt like that second game was where if I were going through it trying to kind of cut the fat a little bit, I probably would have done it there, because I really appreciated the like really sort of true to its origins structure of that first part. But anyway, I agree with you in principle about that.
Yeah, I was mostly the bosses again for me, so maybe if even those were just a little bit shorter, I would have felt better about the first part of the game. But there were times where I was like, okay, this is no longer fun, this is tedious, I just need to execute perfectly. And when I would win, it wasn't that release of like, oh yeah, like I did it, I mastered it. It was like okay, finally I can move on.
Yeah.
And that's not really a fun feeling. Anyway, one other thing that I think that we definitely need to talk about, if only for a couple minutes, is the writing and the humor style of this game, because we've been speaking this. We talked about Horrible and the jokes, but if we hadn't talked about that, you would maybe be going into this game thinking it's a very serious, like epic Ninja Warrior game, and it could not be further from that.
That's the thing, is it actually is that. It just has this humor, like, in addition. I feel like it still takes itself very seriously. It's just that the dialogue is funny, but the story is trying to be serious or something.
Yes and no. Every single bad guy becomes a good guy. Like, everything is like a fluffy, funny, friendly monster who just was like confused, like everything is like played for laughs, except for the fact that the world is coming to an end. But like every single character is goofy,
Yeah, you know what I think is really strange about this is that like it has a lot of lore and story going on. And I mean, I probably should mention that the developers have just finished a Kickstarter campaign for their next game. Is going to be a JRPG set as a prequel in this same world. And it looks amazing, but the writing in this didn't necessarily give me confidence that these folks would do a JRPG that, where the writing is so much more central, that I will really enjoy. We'll wait and see, because I think it looks cool. Like, it could be really great. Yeah. But like this game has the feeling of, and I think even some comments from the developer kind of indicate that maybe this is exactly the case, of like, when you were a kid and you're like 15 and you got like a binder or something, and you come up with the backstory of a world, and maybe this is something that you eventually use as the setting of your D&D campaign with your friends or something like that. Like, it has the feeling of like somebody, probably a kid, spending an enormous amount of time thinking about like a whole world with massive backstory going back eons and lots of big ideas. One of the developers in an interview that I saw basically said that like he'd been making quote unquote The Messenger since he was 12, and that this was based on these big ideas that he had from all this world building that he'd been doing. He'd said he tried to make games set in this world before he really knew how to make games and so on. And I'm like, okay, first of all, that's cool. Like, that's great. It's great to hear that story. Good for him. But there's a bit of a mismatch here for me between this world that is a little bit overcomplicated, like really there's a lot going on in the plot and story, and particularly backstory of the world of The Messenger, and the sort of humorous light tone of the dialogue, which is mostly this sort of it's a style of comedy that doesn't really work well for me. Like, I don't know how to describe it. How would you describe the sort of tone and humor here?
I don't know what to call it. Like high silliness. Like one of the last bosses that you fight are these two bodybuilding buff, like they're like pumping weights and iron, and their moves are like cool guy combo moves, where they're like lifting each other up and doing flying kicks and like flexing.
Okay, I actually have to say that was, of the humor of the game, those guys were probably my favorite bit.
It's funny, but that's where it's at. That's what the bosses
full of very
are doing.
like meta humor too. Like there's a lot of lines in the dialogue, particularly from people like Corbel and the shopkeeper, that are very like winking and nodding that you're in a video game. Corbel in particular is constantly saying things like, that one was, when you die, he'll say things like, that one was probably input lag, right? Or, things like that. So, like, there's also that sort of meta humor of, like, video gamey dialogue, video gamey humor.
But there does have one of my favorite sight gags in a game, really. But in this game is, I think, the second boss. It might be even the first boss that you fight. When you enter, it's like, looks like a really big, like floating wizard holding a giant staff, and it's got its back to you in a big flowing purple robe, and it slowly lowers after saying, some sort of epic thing about how, you're going to be defeated, and it stops where the robe looks like, where its feet would be, and it's standing there, and you think, oh man, I'm going to be fighting this giant wizard. And there's this like just moment of pause when it's there, and then it lowers even more, and the robe drapes along the floor, and you see that the person in the robe is actually like smaller than you are, and it was just that their robe was really big and flowing, and when you look at them from behind, they look like they're huge. And it was just like the timing of it was very funny. So there are some good jokes. And,
it's funny. Like, I think actually thinking back on it, that humor. In the NES game portion, basically, right? Like the linear, before the sort of turn, doing those sorts of jokes with the bosses didn't really feel like it took me out of it. A lot of NES games had slightly goofy bosses. That was fine for me. And for me, where it really started feeling weird was like, once the game started trying to pile its lore on and get very serious about its story, which really happened after the sort of mid-game turn, then the humor and the story stopped fitting together for me.
There's like the messenger, the main character. The game starts out and it's like cliches, like doesn't care about his training, doesn't care about being part of this ancient tribe or ancient sect that is preparing for the end of the world, and like by all accounts would be a really bad ninja. And then everybody dies and you're the only one left, so you become the one. And then for the rest of the game, you're really wacky and really weird and not really like wanting to be a part of it, but you're also really, really good and execute everything. You do the job, and it's like they never really match those two. It's never like, oh, I'm becoming more like the hero that the world wanted. There's no like growth to the character. You're just always this person who's like never seems like they would want to be doing it in the first place. And part of me is like, oh well, are they trying to justify why you die all the time? Right? Like maybe that's the hook. but they never say anything about it. It's just like everybody is silly.
The funny thing about it is that like it's being an NES game style game, it doesn't have a lot of dialogue. But the one place where you do get a lot of spoken dialogue is the shopkeeper, who turns out to be a pretty important character. And the shopkeeper is also probably one of the goofiest parts of the game.
Yeah.
And so it gives you this sort of overwhelming feeling that like this is a game designed to be goofy. But then, of course, you know, even like very towards like within the last hour of the game, there's this like final lore dump that is just like, oh, well, you thought you knew what was going on. Well, here, let me give you a new backstory that goes back many thousands of years further than the already very ancient backstory that you already know, and goes further back into antiquity. And let me introduce new characters to you that are going to be important in the last 10 minutes of the game, and let me tell you things about like the nature of the world and time that you know, it's just so very like if you're maybe this is just like maybe other folks will feel differently about this, but for me it mostly just comes down to that like I find there's a certain incompatibility between sort of light humorous dialogue and very detailed lore. Like I'm totally willing to go along with a game that is cartoony, right? But like then keep the stakes cartoony and keep the sort of world cartoony. But it felt like we had a bunch of cartoon characters in an incredibly detailed D&D setting or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's my point is like, I think that's where the miss is. You have to have serious characters and you have to have like silly characters.
Yeah, and serious characters, there are a couple characters that you could maybe consider serious characters, but they say like 10 words, like a serious character might, right? But like they're playing against characters who, like, the shopkeeper has reams of dialogue. Particularly, there's certain things you can do, like if you interact with his cabinet in his store. There are these rants he'll go on with unskippable dialogue. It's a bit of a joke, right? You know, it's intended to be one of these things like it's like, don't touch that cabinet, and if you keep doing it, you end up in these like unskippable like cabinet rants that are kind of funny, but like. The vast majority of the actual dialogue in this game is the shopkeeper, one of the very goofiest parts of the game. So it feels on balance like all the characters are super, super goofy, and the setting they're in and the story they're playing out is super not goofy, or at least not intended to be, and it takes away from one of them. Sometimes both.
Yeah. Well, it'd be different too. It's like, it's hard to always be funny. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think maybe West of Loathing is maybe the only game that has had like a significant amount of dialogue in which I've found almost all of it to be funny, right? But I think this game is like 30% like really funny and interesting, and then like 70% just like always trying jokes, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a lot of just like, it's not even groaning bad jokes. It's just like,
man, they're mostly like, you're right. It's like 70% misses.
Yeah. But I bet everybody's 30% is a little different too, you know? So it's hard to say that it's not funny. Like it's a weird balance of things. I think that's ultimately what it is.
Yeah.
Like the humor is at times really good, and the stories that the shopkeeper tells at times are funny and introspective and interesting. Mm-hmm. And then at times you're like, okay, just stop. Like, let me get to the next thing. I don't know if I don't know if I want to talk to the shopkeeper anymore because I just really want to play the mechanics. But every once in a while, it's very funny and very interesting, so it's worth it for me to talk to him. Or sometimes I have to because he's giving out a skill or something, and if I don't talk to him, I don't get it.
Yeah, and you know, speaking of that, like I feel like I've spent a lot of time talking to the characters during the first half of the game, and at some point I kind of realized, you know, I'm not really loving the humor of this game. And so I kind of stopped talking to the shopkeeper, and the game pretty much allows you to do that. Like, there's certainly going to be times where you have to talk to some of the various characters, but like I found myself mostly focusing on the action and mostly ignoring the dialogue. And the game doesn't really get in your way with that stuff. The places where you do have to talk to characters, mostly those things, those like required conversations are pretty short, and you button mash your way through them. If you miss something important, you can always go back to those characters and talk to them again. So something like the prophet, for example, if you get the tip from him and then you wander away and you forget what he said, you can go back and he'll tell you immediately. You don't have to go through a bunch of dialogue trees or anything like that. So it does support, like, if you aren't that into the dialogue, you don't have to engage with it really. And if you are into it, there's a lot of it that you can potentially opt into.
There's plenty of it there for you. Yeah. So I think this has been a good balanced discussion, because overall, we spent the first 45 minutes of this talking about how much we really liked it. And then we have spent the last 20 minutes kind of talking about things that have not really been, were not really as good as, we were hoping, or really just didn't feel great, I think, is really what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of it's a bit of a down from the incredible highs of the controls and action. I guess in order to leave it with a sandwich, I do want to talk about one thing that I really, really loved about the game we haven't mentioned yet, which is the soundtrack. This game has a kick-ass soundtrack, and in fact, it kind of has two kick-ass soundtracks, because the entire soundtrack was made once in the 8-bit style and then a second time in a Genesis 16-bit style, and both of them slap. They are good soundtracks, in my opinion. What do you think about it?
I mean, I think it's great, and I think it ties a lot of it together. And I think the stuff that we're saying about this game that are great, it looks great, it sounds great, and it feels great. It's just a little too long in some parts, and it's not as funny as it wants to be.
As it thinks it is.
But overall, I think this is a really cool game, and I'm really glad that we played it. And I also appreciate, we talk about games when we appreciate a game going for it, while the humor doesn't really match and it might be a little too long, I will say that I appreciate them trying this really, really expansive blend of things. I think there's a world where this game is just the second half, and they're look at our cool time period swapping game where you're going between 8 and 16-bit, and that could have been the whole game, right? And that's probably what all the write-ups would have been about, and that's what the whole thing would have been, a game where you're going between two different time periods of platforming slashers. Or they could have just done the first half and been hey, we made a really good retro throwback game, just play it, it's fun, it's a good hack and slash, and you're good. Instead, they put it all together and they made this complete thing that is pretty lofty for a game. I think it accomplishes more than it fails at, and I think it's worth playing.
Absolutely. I'm really, really glad we played it. It's been on my list of things that I wanted to play for a very long time. And what eventually pushed me over the edge was I had this game on PC because there was it had been on my list for a long time, and then it became one of the free games on the Epic Game Store when they were giving out games for free, and I started it there and really quite enjoyed it. But this is the kind of game that I really wanted to be playing on my Switch. So when it went on sale on the Switch, I picked it up there, and then I've just been having a really, really fun time with it. So glad we got a chance to talk about it for the show, even if it is a little bit longer than the sorts of things we typically cover. It's still within our basic zone, and so I would definitely recommend folks check this one out if you like a difficult, challenging but rewarding platformer. And I'm really looking forward to finding out what these people do in the JRPG space, because I don't know. I really don't know what that game is going to be like, but I think it'll be very interesting.
It's going to be 700 hours.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I should add one last thing. They released a free DLC for this that I haven't touched yet, but it's called the Picnic Panic DLC, and it basically just adds an extra sort of mini campaign that you can play through. And it looks super cute and fun. It's beach themed and tiki themed, and I can't wait to go back to and give that little bit a shot. It looks super cute.
That is targeted right at Raygan.
Oh yeah,
tiki themed.
Yeah. So anyway, recommend this game. So thank you for listening to The Short Game. And you can find our show on the internet at www.theshortgame.net. And you can also find us on Patreon at patreon.com/theshortgame. If you'd like to support the show, like our wonderful supporters such as Robert Hawks, Adam Saleh, and Eric Faro, thank you so much to all of you and to all the rest of our patrons for supporting us. And if you would like to join those fine people on our Discord, supporters on Patreon at any level get immediate access to our Discord, which is where we talk about the show, we plan things out, we talk about the games that we're playing, we talk about our various stock prices on Animal Crossing New Leaf. That's still a thing that's happening there right now. And we'd just love to have folks join us there. So if you've been a listener and you haven't supported us, now would be a great time. Just hop on to patreon.com/theshortgame and join the conversation. You can also, of course, find us on Twitter at @_shortgame. And you can find our contact form on our website, www.theshortgame.net. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm Raygan at RayganK on Twitter, RayGanK. And Nate, where can people find you?
On Twitter at NateSTL.
And thank you for listening to The Short Game.